This week on Dialogue, President Nixon visits China, the week that changed the world. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. And now I'd like to introduce our guests. J. Stapleton Roy achieved the rank of career ambassador after 4.5 decades in the U.S. Foreign Service. He served as U.S. ambassador to China, Singapore, and Indonesia. Currently, he's director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Yafeng is an associate professor of history at Long Island University in New York and a guest professor at the Center for Cold War International History Studies with East China Normal University in Shanghai. He's also a fellow with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. Douglas Spelman is deputy director of the Kissinger Institute. He served as an interpreter for the 1972 visit to the United States of the Chinese ping pong team. He joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 1977 and served as U.S. Consul General in Shanghai. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
I want to ask you to indulge us in a little bit of time travel. Take us back to those days of 1972 and help create the context for the Nixon visit. What was the context leading up to it? What was the state of relations between the countries? If we can start with you.
Sure. The reason why the Nixon visit was such an extraordinary event was because we had faced a unified communist world during the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And then the dispute between China and the Soviet Union became visible to outsiders during the 1960s. But the United States, instead of having one implacable foe, now had two implacable foes because we had no diplomatic relations with China, and it was our relations were extremely hostile. And so when Dr. Kissinger suddenly showed up in Beijing in July of 1971 to prepare for a visit by the President of the United States to China, this was an extraordinary breakthrough where China basically and the United States were beginning to find a way to cooperate because of our common concern about the threat from the Soviet Union. I was in the Moscow embassy at that time, the U.S. embassy in the Soviet Union, and I saw what a dramatic impact it had on the attitude of the Russians.
Since we are there now, tell us about that. What did people in Russia think when Dr. Kissinger shows up in China?
Well, they realized it was a devastating blow to their position in the world. Until he showed up, I was covering Soviet foreign policy in East Asia. I could not get into the foreign ministry and meet any of their Asian experts until Dr. Kissinger showed up in Moscow, in Beijing. All of a sudden they wanted to see me. And so my period in Moscow after that, I was meeting all of their China specialists. Mm-hmm. Before that, I couldn't meet any of them.
Doug, again, think back. I'm sure it's difficult, especially for younger people now who are used to the United States and China interacting normally, to remember what it was like. Paint a picture for us of '72.
Well, I came at it from a slightly different perspective. I was studying most of the 60s about China, but the word of Kissinger's visit was the same kind of shock to the academic world because all of us had been studying about China. And of course, we had hoped to go there. Many of us had spent time in Taiwan because that was the only part of China, in addition to Hong Kong, that you could get to. So it was a blow. I might say, too, I wasn't directly involved, but the other people to which this was a great blow were the Vietnamese, because here was the country that was helping them in the fight against the United States, and here the President of the United States was going to Beijing. So it must have been an enormous shock, as in Moscow, in Hanoi.
Yafeng, what do you remember? And where were you at the time? Mm-hmm.
Well, I was 7 years old at that time.
He's just bragging.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
But I studied this part of the history of the foreign policy of the People's Republic of China, especially U.S.-China relation in the last 12 years. And my understanding of this issue, now it was really a fundamentally important issue for China. Because in the previous 22 years, the Chinese people believed that the United States of America was China's #1 enemy. The United States has been demonized in China for such a long time, but suddenly our great leader, Chairman Mao, made the decision to shake hands with China's #1 enemy, Nixon. So this, I think that it's a weak. That changed the world in the sense that without Mao's decision to reach the rapprochement with the United States, it will be very hard for Deng Xiaoping 5-6 years later, 7 years later, to achieve normalization with the United States. And you will not be able to see China's great development in the last 30 years. So in that sense, it's really the weak that changed the world.
Not hyperbole, it actually did. Yafeng mentions that from the Chinese perspective, America was enemy #1. Vice versa, enemy 1A or #2? How did the United States view China at the time?
We certainly viewed China as an enemy. But our #1 enemy remained the Soviet Union because they had a much larger nuclear arsenal than China had, and the threat was simply greater. But China was the country bordering Vietnam with whom we were fighting a war with high casualties, and therefore China, in the images of Americans, and if you look at the movies at the time, it was the Chinese troops wearing athletic shoes who were visualized as part of the threat.
How did this trip originate? Whose idea was it? How far back did it go?
Oh.
The notion that if Richard Nixon were elected, this may be a bold stroke in foreign policy that he would
It originated with President Nixon, who saw the opportunity. The problem was how to communicate with China, because we didn't have effective means for trying to explore the possibility. The idea emerged in a serious way after the clashes between Russian and Chinese troops on the Ussuri River border in the spring of 1969. And the United States made several unsuccessful efforts to convey messages to China. China made an unsuccessful effort to convey a warming signal to us through Edgar Snow, who was in China and was up in the Tiananmen reviewing the troops, I guess, in the National Day. And he conveyed a message from Chairman Mao, but Americans paid no attention to it. So it failed to get the message across. So it took the Pakistani link before we were able to find a way of communicating and setting up the visit.
Doug, conventional wisdom on American politics is that it would only be a Republican president who could make this move at this time.
Right, right.
Is that a fair assessment?
Sure. It's now become a statement. You know, it's like Nixon going to China. It describes a kind of complete about-face. Let me just add one thing, too. Even though sort of officially China was our enemy #1, one thing which impressed me about the ping pong tour, that is when the Chinese ping pong team came to the United States in the spring of '72, after Nixon had gone, was the warm welcome that they received from the sort of common American people, even though there had been such animosity at an official level and even at a personal level. But in a way it was a master stroke, because it's a little hard to get terribly angry at ping pong players, if you will. You know, so
I don't know, when they're whipping your butt.
Well, that's true. They did. But it was a kind of unthreatening kind of opening, and it really worked brilliantly. We went to several cities and in every place, and we were entertained in homes and so forth. And I was very gratified that even there were some demonstrations against the Chinese, that's for sure. Yeah. But by and large, it was a welcoming attitude.
Was there a similar sense of welcome on the Chinese, from the Chinese side of the equation?
Yes. Let me talk a little bit about the Chinese side. Most thinking of reach a rapprochement with the United States. That actually by 1968 and 1969, the Soviet Union had become China's #1 enemy. because of the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia and also the border clash in spring of 1969, the Sino-Soviet border crash at Zembao. So at this point, Mao was a leader who had been talking about a class struggle domestically and exporting old revolution. Exporting revolution around the world for the last 20 years. And now, by this point, he found that which achieved very little in Africa and Latin America, very little appreciated results of exporting revolution worldwide. And also, he was also unhappy with the kind of fighting and negotiation which the Vietnamese was going on with the United States. So he was disappointed with his approach of exporting old revolution. Now, this is one thing that he believed that it's time to have a united front to fight against the main enemy. That's the Soviet Union. So he felt that he needs to change his policy, at least temporarily, to seek a détente with the United States in order to deal with China's main enemy, that's the Soviet Union by this point. And of course, I think that the Chinese people, although have been the United States has been demonized in China for 20 years, but the Chinese people, from their heart, they never believed that American was a real enemy. But Soviet Union actually, because of the territorial dispute in history, so the Chinese people actually had very good feeling towards the United States, the ordinary people.
With the benefit of all the hindsight that we have now looking back, and also with the archives opened up in the Cold War History Project and elsewhere, could you say that this was the key turning point in the Cold War, and that this was a major factor in eventually the Soviet Union unraveling? Because now the United States could turn its attention to its competition with the Soviets because China was now sitting in a different place. Is that revisionist history, or is that a fair?
No, I think it's fair. I was working on Soviet affairs, not on East Asia. I didn't go to East Asia for over a decade. From 65 until 74, I was working on the Soviet Union, not on the China side of things. And to me, it was the psychological turning point in the Cold War. The Russians knew that from that point on, what they would call the correlation of forces was no longer in their favor. We had been psychologically defensive during the period when communist rule was extending across many, many countries. And that, of course, was one of the reasons why the Vietnam War was fought, because we were so concerned about the continuing expansion of the areas under Soviet communist influence. And this really turned things around in a major way.
I also wonder, what's different about communism as practiced in China versus communism as it was practiced in the old Soviet Union, which didn't last? What are the main differences? Why did one system collapse under its own weight while another system seems to be thriving?
Go ahead. That's a big one.
When Mao Zedong first came to power in 1949 and 1950, at that time, he was following Stalinism, which is... but by 1956, when Khrushchev started to denounce Stalin in the secret speech at the Communist Party Congress, that Khrushchev was moving towards more of a consumer communism to improve the life of the people. But Mao, at this point, he still believed that it is important to struggle with the United States, with the capitalist world. The most important is worldwide revolution. So, but of course, after the death of Mao, the Deng Xiaoping was pursuing a different kind of communism.
Now, let's fast forward to today. As we tape, this is the week that Vice President Xi was in town and just left for the West Coast. A whole new world, lots of time has passed. Where do we stand now? What are the areas of most commonality, and what are the areas that are still bones of contention that need to be worked on?
Areas of commonality?
Let's start with the positive.
China used to favor the proliferation of nuclear weapons in order to break the monopoly of the imperialist countries or the big powers in having nuclear weapons. China turned around decades ago on that question, and now China does not see it in its interest or in the interest of the world to have nuclear weapons proliferate. So China and the United States have both been opposed to the nuclear weapons program in North Korea. While we in China have different interests overall with respect to Iran, China has no interest in seeing Iran acquire a nuclear capability because it sees the implications for the Middle East and the proliferation pressures that will be increased. We in China are the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases. If the United States and China are not prepared to work together to try to address the issue of global warming, other countries will not see any purpose in it because the two largest creators of the greenhouse gases will not be stepping up to the plate. So you could extend this areas of commonality extensively, but at the same time we have the historic problem of Taiwan, which remains unresolved, and which is a very sensitive issue in U.S.-China relations. China has different interests in North Korea from the United States, reflected in China's desire to maintain as good relations as it can with Pyongyang at a time of leadership transition there. Whereas our view is we want to maximize pressure on North Korea to get it to move back to a denuclearization policy. So this is just illustrative of the fact that we have very significant areas of cooperation and overlapping interests, and we have significant areas where there are severe differences of interest between the two countries.
I would totally agree and add that one thing that makes the relationship complex is that many of our common interests within themselves have difficulties. Take economics for a matter. That's one of the areas where we have the most vital interaction, and both sides have benefited enormously from this economic relationship. But it's also the one that generates a good deal of tension. So that's why it's so complex. The interests and the difficulties sometimes are all wrapped up in single issues.
We certainly don't have time to wade through the entire complexity of the economic relations, but let's dig a little deeper in that. Now we're in the midst of a presidential campaign here. China often invoked as a pejorative about the fact that it's part of the U.S. debt problem, part of the U.S. Trade deficit, part of all these economic problems that the U.S. has. What's a fair and realistic assessment of the benefits, the mutual benefits, or the problems in the economic relations between the two nations?
I'll stick my neck out. I mean, the benefits are enormous. For one thing, from the American side, we gain inexpensive, increasingly high-quality products. The trade deficit is much against us, but we benefit. American consumers benefit from that. China benefits from an enormous market. We benefit from China's then reinvesting the profits from that into our national debt. So these are enormous benefits. I think, just to comment briefly on we seem to have focused on the currency and the value of the Chinese currency as one issue. I think most people, most economists that I know, I'm not an economist, seem to think this really wouldn't make much difference. And there are other issues which we could focus on, such as subsidies which Chinese manufacturers enjoy, which helps make their products less expensive in the U.S. But this exchange rate is not going to change very much.
Also, I want to add that actually there are some very new recent phenomena that in this new year, many Chinese actually order American products. There are a large percent of Chinese are getting very rich, and they like American high-quality products. And they ordered by phone, and they were delivered by air to China. So as very luxury products as gifts for the new year. So American actually, there's a huge market. That's one thing. Another, the Chinese still admire Americans' higher education so much that you might know that President Xi Jinping's daughter is in Yale, and the Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi's daughter is in Yale. So many of the high officials, just not the high official, but the middle class, they can afford American education for their only children. So I think that's also a very substantial area for U.S. and China for good relation and cooperation.
I teach a course for Penn State on politics and media, and one of my students this past fall semester was a Chinese exchange student who used the nickname Washington and had aspirations to go home someday and change the world. Very ambitious young man.
I agree with Professor Shaw, but we did a conference here at the Wilson Center some time ago, looking at what affects the attitudes of people in each country toward the other country. Mm-hmm. And we looked at areas such as views of religion, views of law, views of human rights, the role of the media, etc. And we find that there are many historic differences in the way that we approach these questions. So that the societal differences between China and the United States do influence our attitudes, especially in areas such as human rights, which America feels so strongly about because our nation, since its beginning, has had a human rights massive problem embedded in our own country, and therefore we have developed a pattern of struggling to improve human rights. Most of it was domestically oriented in our history.
Are you describing a cultural incompatibility?
Cultures are all different. You go to Europe and you see enormous differences. Incompatible is not the right word, because I find that no matter how different cultures are, there's always areas of compatibility between them.
Sure.
That's right. Mm-hmm. But this is where you have different types of approaches. For example, historically in China, China had many religions, but they were all under the aegis of the emperor. Mm-hmm. So it's closer, say, to England, where the Queen is the head of the Church of England. But we have a view that the government should have nothing to do with religion, that we should be free to practice it, free of government control or influence. And here there is a historical and cultural difference in terms of attitude.
One thing that I found interesting in the speaking of media, the coverage of this current visit, sort of muted. Which in some ways I view as a testament to the success of the Nixon visit 40 years later, that now there are normal relations between the countries. It's not as epic when leaders cross the ocean.
Muted in U.S. media.
Yes, that was, I mean, today below the
not
fold
much muted
in the Washington
in Chinese.
Post, for
Chinese
example.
media, it's
well,
not,
tell us
muted.
about that. You appeared on Chinese television recently.
Well, you looked this morning. I looked at the China Daily USA edition, which is now done in New York. The whole front page, several inside pages are filled with Xi's visit. So it's an enormous effect, which is one point from the Chinese point of view. They want to show their public that this is a very important relationship, and despite differences, it's something that the country needs to pursue seriously.
Also, a coming out party for the new presumptive new leader.
No, that's true.
That's right.
Yeah, that's true.
A point I would emphasize, since I spent 4 years as ambassador in Beijing, during the period when we didn't have top leaders exchanging visits. Yeah. We did have some meetings, but they were rare. Whereas now, the President of the United States, the President of China are meeting 10, 12, even more times a year, at both on a bilateral basis and at international conferences they attend. This is an enormously helpful development in managing the relationship.
I guess that's part of what I'm reacted to, and as I process the coverage, is it's almost business as usual.
Yeah, well.
And the things that have gotten coverage are some of the unique aspects, like a trip to Iowa, some of those aspects. What are your sense of the size of the story, relatively speaking, between the countries?
Probably that for China it's very important. This trip is very important because Xi Jinping will be the next leader of China probably for 10 years. And this is a trip, this is his show to prove to the world that he's a world leader and he's interested in improving relations with the United States. But on the U.S. side, maybe you have too many other important things going on. So this is just one part of it. But for China, this is central point before the Party's Congress. Yes.
We only have a couple minutes left, and I'd like you to spend those, if you would, looking forward to. Are we looking at, are there areas we could look forward to significant breakthroughs in cooperation and relations between our countries? Or are we now into that more incremental stage? Where do we, and we can give a few minutes or a few seconds to each of you. Doug, let's start with you.
I would say we're in the incremental stage. I would think the fact that we'd have some enormous breakthrough that would redefine the relationship, say like the Nixon trip or something of similar magnitude, the chances are very small. I mean, we're so engaged, though. I mean, that's the good side. We're so engaged on so many things. It may be incremental, but we've got so much going on that it's also difficult to imagine a total breakdown. Could happen again, but...
Yafeng?
Yeah, I think that I agree with Doug that the relation will be incremental, but it is also very important for the United States to recognize China's justified leads in defending its national security, and also there is a nationalism tendency in China, so the Chinese leader have the difficulty of facing that kind of challenges.
Mr. Ambassador, I saved the final word for you.
Well, it reminds me a little bit about the joke about $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. I agree with my colleagues that I think it's the question of the steps we are taking. We're not looking for giant breakthroughs, but steps constitute trends. And if the trend is in the wrong direction in our relationship toward growing strategic rivalry, then both leaders have an enormous responsibility on their shoulders to try to reverse that. Because I have never met any analyst who believes that somehow the situation in East Asia or the interests of the United States or China would be improved by a confrontational relationship between our two countries. So these incremental steps matter, because together they constitute trends, and the trends either move in the wrong direction or the right direction.
Excellent point,
and I believe that Vice President Xi's visit here contributes to trying to move the trends in the right direction rather than the wrong direction.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching as well. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.